Hello everyone, it's your favorite shrimp. So I haven't done one of these in quite a while, but on this one we're going to be looking through a map that I was sent by a viewer. I haven't done a map review in quite a while, but you know, they chose a song that I actually did a whole video on, and they wanted my opinion on it. So this is the Yume Chizu map, or song, and I did a whole demonstration of like my thought process of how I would choose to like rhythm and pattern as a, I think, fairly experienced rank mapper. So I don't actually know what the AR was there, but hey, we're gonna go ahead and take a look and see if I have anything to say on their attempt at it. Obviously, as you can see, it's not complete, but that's fine. All right, so right off the bat, first section here, a couple things that I like and a couple things that I don't think were done as well. Right off the bat, this is actually quite nice. I really like the contrast between the slow and the fast slider here, but I think that some of that contrast is lost here because you have this like larger gap, and then you have a really nice contrast with the faster movement here, but then you have another large gap with like faster movement, but this is going to feel very similar to this, but when you actually listen to it, they're not the same sounds, really. And I think having so many of this, like, large gap really, or the same type of movement and that kind of thing, is going to hinder the enjoyability of your map to some degree. So with this one, I would separate this one a little bit, maybe have an anti-flow type of idea where the movement changes a little bit here, like this, to really exaggerate the drum there, and it's a slightly different thing. Then moving into this part, we have to pay very close attention to how things actually play, because I'm guessing that this was an arrangement that was supposed to sort of emulate this a little bit. But part of the problem is with this large gap in the timeline, you lose a lot of that, all the intensity there. And the way that these objects are oriented, the fact that they're both sliders and things, they have slider leniency, where you don't actually have to very closely follow the slider body or anything like that in order to still 300 the slider. So the way you have it arranged, you can basically go from here to here, right, without ever stopping. But that really contradicts what the song is doing, I think, with how sort of staccato that the piano is there. And it doesn't result in that emphasis, that big impact here, that cymbal crash in the song actually is indicating that it warrants, right? So a better approach, I think, is possibly some sliders, where if you have some sliders that switch to the longer slider, so you have shorter sliders and they switch to the longer slider with the slower SV, I think helps a lot with that big impact there for that cymbal crash, the same way that you emphasized this one. So that's what I would consider doing for sure. Same idea here with, this arrangement and this arrangement kind of being too similar when they're really not supposed to be. And I'm not a huge fan of the stack here either, because it really just kills all that intensity, especially going into another really low intensity section. So you basically have no action at all. And then you really have this random jump to this one where really all of this is just one drum phrase. So all of these are kind of interconnected, and really the big impact is supposed to be here. But the way you have it set up, the big impact's actually here because it comes from that stack. And then there's only that 1/2 gap to jump to this. So that's what's actually being emphasized, which is contradictory to what the song is actually telling you it should be doing. On the contrary, you have something like this, which this stack, and then you have the big jump to where the cymbal crash actually is. And that is actually, this one's done much more effectively as a result of that. These kinds of nuanced things really matter a lot. And so you have this build up here, which is fine. This rhythm's not quite correct in my opinion, because It's actually like a 1/6 or a 1/8 type of um, crescendo. Simplification's okay, but if it's a top difficulty, I don't think it's needed. And I think that there's sort of maybe more accurate ways of representing that simplification, perhaps a kick slider or something like that. Doing 2 kick sliders instead of just not mapping it at all, because it's very clear that that piano crescendo, which is what this circle is trying to sort of map, is not being mapped because it's just not. This isn't the correct rhythm choice in terms of it's not the correct snapping. That being said, when I listen to this, I hear like that really impactful drum rhythm, and so I think I would probably map it more like this and ignore that little tiny burst there, and really highlight these 2 drums with kick sliders, and then let that burst be that nice transition into the next section. And I think this is just a much more compelling rhythm, personally, rather than being like just the basic choice of burst into another burst into a slightly longer burst, which, this is like, a fairly basic rhythm choice. Similar idea to what I talked about before with that slider leniency. This is one of the most common mistakes, in my opinion, that people make across the board, even experienced mappers, where they just don't respect slider leniency. This part here is fine, although I'm kind of a hater of blankets because I think that they're a crutch that hinders mapping. But, assuming that we have this, the problem is that you don't actually have to play the slider at all. You can basically just go straight to here, and that makes this circle, or this slider, especially with this 1/2 gap, extremely underwhelming. So I definitely would recommend spacing that more. So then you have something like this. And then, we have this pattern here. All this is fine here. But, this slider right here, but this is clearly representing a different rhythm than what was being represented over here. There's a really important change here. And so I really probably would not connect these 2 in the way you have. I might consider continuing the circle idea and then separating this one more, or I guess you can do both, assuming that you're doing this, I would connect it to where it actually is supposed to be more connected to, which is this follow-up section. You have this section, and this synth sound or piano sound, whatever's there, is sort of just being repeated here, but you are going to a completely different pattern. So a more compelling arrangement, in my opinion, would be doing something like this, where you really actually pay attention to that kind of nuance of that repeated instrumental there by having sort of that repeated movement there. And then, probably something like this. I think I like that. And then you have, something like that. And something like this is really going to stand out a lot and make your map really, really memorable. Okay, so here's something that I'm also going to comment on, I think, in the chorus as well, but we got to be careful with our stacks, because if you stack everything, then you're going to make the map kind of feel like nothing. To a certain point, stacks are really great for emphasizing things, but if we try to emphasize everything with stacks, nothing gets emphasized, right? It just makes the stacks kind of meaningless, and oftentimes kind of awkward to play, or like it hinders the fun of it, because people don't like to just like stay still for very long. And so I think what we are running into a bit of a problem with is stacking too much, especially in not where it's like right on top of each other. You can go opposite flow and that kind of thing, but be very careful with what you stack and how you stack it, because when I see this in this very high energy section and we're stacking 2 things next to each other for completely different sounds, I have a bit of an issue with that. So, maybe pick one to stack and then unstack the other one. Especially considering this one wasn't stacked, and then you stacked this one, and these are, of course, very similar sounds again. Same idea as over here. This one's fine. This is actually a good use of that stack, because it lowers the intensity here in this little transition phrase, and then it comes back up when that piano comes back. So I think this is a better use of that stack where it doesn't bring as much attention to this specific part, because there's not as much to emphasize there. But here, there is that piano. There is that piano here, right? So it doesn't really make as much sense to stack here, I think. I'd consider actually just deleting this one, because I think right now you have two stacks that are basically the same. If you delete this one, it makes this one a little bit less intense, and then this one a little bit more intense, and I think this one here. And I think that's a cool little contrast as the song develops. Kind of the same idea here with that spacing. Space it a little bit more maybe, or have it grow, but right now it's kind of just all the same spacing. You're just doing a triangle. Not the most interesting or enjoyable movement there. You can like see when I played it there, I'm barely moving my cursor. Okay. So I think in general, this section here feels okay because it really does capture that vibe of the song where it's just sort of meandering. Nothing's really particularly being emphasized in your mapping, and there's nothing really in the song that's like being emphasized that strongly either. So it really does a good job of sort of capturing the feel there. That being said, there's still places that it could be improved. Like, for example, here, where you have this piano sound being represented here, and then this one's more of a drum, I think, focused one, maybe a little bit of a vocal, and this one doesn't really have that. Like, the song is actually cutting out here actively. You can listen to that backing instrumental there. And you've mapped it the same way, which I don't think is the best way of approaching that. Maybe like this would be a better approach. Even then, if I had to say, I might even ignore that vocal right here. Because if you're listening to the song here, you have this like piano that you're mapping with this repeat, then the follow-up of that is right here. So maybe... Nah. Okay, maybe your rhythm is the better choice. Yeah, I'm fine with that, I guess. But probably I would do this. There is no sound here. But you could just stack it like that, which I think is really cool. Okay, so now we're into this next section. This section is pretty intense, but it's not very rhythm dense, I think. I think there's a lot of energy in the instrumental and in the vocals, but it's not dense. There's not a lot of sound, I guess. But the way you've mapped it is extremely low density and very low spacing, which is a bit contradictory to what I think the energy of the song here is. So I would consider spacing this a lot more. And then, of course, I think that we could probably do with a rotation change, because this entire section here, if you've noticed, is moving counterclockwise. And that movement, the way you have it already, continues in that same counterclockwise direction. So it would give more of an impact if in this section we finally get that rotation change the other direction. It's a bit of a subtle thing, but it really helps a lot. You'd be surprised. So yeah, I definitely consider like changing this a little bit. Anyway. But yeah, I think if we manipulate the spacing here a little bit and then change the rotation, I'd like that section a lot more. Right now, because of those two things, I'm not sure I like it. But I like the rhythm choice. This rhythm choice is good as well. This is a better use of that spacing where there's not really, again, really huge points of emphasis here. It's sort of just the general vibe is fairly intense, but the density is supported by what the actual song is doing. So you don't have to emphasize things with spacing. It's being emphasized with that density. I think this is a much better approach to that. And then this one needs to be emphasized differently, right? Because this is a very different instrumental. So perhaps like a back and forth would be cool. Like that. You could do something like that. You could do something linear, right? And really make it feel different like that. But I think having that, or another option even, is you just change the rotation direction. Change that rotation direction. Any of those choices, I think, really would make that pop out. But right now, because of how you've oriented it, if I got rid of the NCs, you wouldn't even notice that there was a difference in that patterning. Obviously, I have to change that, but... You know, if I turn off the music, you wouldn't be able to tell there's a difference. It would just look like it just looks like one continuous buildup, and that's not what the song is really doing. There is that point of emphasis, that big impact on these last three. Okay, this is really don't do this. So don't do this because again, it's that slider leniency, right? You don't ever have to play this whole slider. You just go from here to here. And then you wait. And that's not very engaging or enjoyable. Do this, and then space this. Or you can space this and do like that. Somewhere over here that actually incentivizes the player to play the slider. This is just a very forced arrangement where it looks like you didn't have any ideas to where to put it. Which is probably not what you want. And it also doesn't really make sense that in the more intense part of the song, we're not unstacking our 1/4 gaps, because if we remember going over here in this earlier section, this was how you spaced your 1/4 gaps. So it doesn't really make sense that, or 1/4 gaps out of sliders, I should say. So it doesn't really make sense that we're not doing it here in the chorus, right? So pick one, do both, and you can really go pretty crazy on that 1/4 spacing. That's totally fine. It doesn't have to be, you know, too subdued. Okay. And then if you're going to have these stacks as points of like unique things in this section, which is fine. I think they actually work quite well to emphasize that unique vocal rhythm. You got to be really careful using stacks elsewhere, because if you have too many stacks, you lose the intensity of the section. So this stack here, this stack here, these things are taking away from this being special, because they're all stacks. They're all low intensity. So be very careful there. I would unstack all these other ones and leave the stacks for the special thing, or find a different way to make this special. And this is an interesting. This is like probably the opposite of how I had mapped it, where I would map it as a descending spacing, given that pitch decreases on that. So I would decrease the spacing there because of that. Although I think that the idea of using a deceleration or an acceleration spacing is the right approach, the which way you go kind of matters a little bit. You gotta have support that with the song. And sometimes, like, when I'm guessing that the reason you do this is because the rhythm here is a little bit awkward with the vocals and the drums and things like that. And actually, sometimes the best way to really capture the song is to really lean heavily into sort of the awkward mismatches of the drums and the vocals and things. That awkwardness to the player really makes that section emphasized, which is kind of, I think, the same idea as to why the song is sort of, disconnecting them a little bit. Okay. So that's all you have on this. So hopefully that gave you some places to, improve in the future and improve this map moving forward. It's not bad, but I think that there's some places where you can really highlight the points of emphasis and not undermine your own mapping choices, because I think you have good choices in isolation, but big picture-wise, they don't always work super well together. And so that's what I would bring your attention to. And we can, for quick reference, I guess we can see if I can find the version that I did, which I think is this one. I probably had it on like 8 or 9, so I'm not sure why it's lower, but... So you can kind of look at like how intentionally I'm grouping things, right? So like with this, short stubby sliders with the long held slider really brings that impact onto the long held slider, and then very tightly integrating things into these geometric patterns that I want to be connected, even if the rhythms aren't the same. In this case, I wanted to separate things, so I used that linear and we went over to a different part of the playfield, right? In this case, I think I did simplify it, which I did, but... So is that? Okay. So it's actually interesting that looking at my map now after, I mapped this, 6 months ago, something like that? So it's been a while. So, and also I mapped it in like 30 minutes, so it wasn't like a high effort thing or anything like that, so not very memorable to me. But it's kind of interesting, some of the similarities of how you approached it compared to mine, whether or not that was intentional on your part or not, I don't know. But it really, I think, goes to show that execution plays a huge part in whether something works or not. There's really not very many things that are just bad ideas. What matters is how you execute on that idea. You can basically make anything work. So, one of the major things that I've already noticed, right, that I mentioned earlier to you was when I'm in this section here, this is an intense section, I didn't use any stacks, right? until I got to the part that I wanted to emphasize with stacks, right? And then everything else is unstacked. Whereas on yours, you did a lot of stacks that were unrelated to this part, and then you still did these overlaps or like low spacing things. In your case, it was low spacing overlaps. In my case, it was these stacks. But because they're so similar, they end up interfering with each other's sort of idea, and you lose what makes each one special. And you got to sort of pick your battles. Which one do you want to stand out more? In my case, the way I did it was I wanted this one to stand out a lot more, so I left the stacks only for that. In your case, you didn't really hard commit to making this special, this rhythm special. And then, like, when we had this, I don't know actually if you got to this part. I think you did actually everything. So, like, you did this here, which was a long slider, very long slider, into sliders, into another really long slider. And, like, looking at mine again, I think what I did was I used a very similar idea to what I had here. Because this is I think they're pretty similar, like, vocal phrases. So having that same idea that I took, where it was the stack, but different in the way that there's now 3 of them, they're much bigger spacing, they're linear spacing like this, and then making this section a unique pattern that I hadn't done before, I think really helps make this section stand out a lot more. It has that spice where I don't think that you'd had that. You had sort of the sliders into more sliders into more sliders sort of thing. That was pretty common. And then a different jump arrangement for this one is what I used here for this specific decrescendo. And you can see that mine is decreasing in spacing as that volume goes down, whereas yours didn't. So, not to say that my choice is the only choice by any means. I'm not saying that. But hopefully, you know, especially when you compare the two, maybe some of what I did makes a little bit more sense compared to, obviously, what I'm saying with regard to yours. Anyway, that's my thoughts, and hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, shoot me a message. Obviously, reached out to me on Osu, so feel free to do that again if you care. It's as simple as that.